Well, welcome to the More to the Story podcast. I'm so glad that you all have come along for this episode. And I'm excited in a minute just to introduce our guest to you. He's somebody that I've read for a long time and appreciated his historical work, his global work as well. And some of you will have known him maybe even through his book that came out more than 20 years ago now, or about 20 years ago now, The Next Christendom. But there's several other things that he's done, and I think you'll find this very interesting. But some of you who follow this podcast regularly, and if you don't, we'd love for you to subscribe, like, share links to this, whatever it is that you do. If you're seeing it on YouTube, if you're following this just on a podcast app, we'd love for you to know that this podcast comes to you from Wesley Biblical Seminary, where we are sending out trusted leaders from faithful churches, but for faithful churches, not just from, I guess they do come a lot of times from faithful churches, but we're also hopeful too that as people get into these churches, they're also drawing people to the church. And we're looking forward. I think even today, you'll learn things about the nature of the way societies or structures and empires function that might be interesting to think about that evangelistic task. Nevertheless, we offer all sorts of degrees, from bachelor's, master's, doctoral degrees. I'm privileged to serve as the president of Wesley Biblical Seminary in this period where we're experiencing exponential growth. We've had 20% increase in our full-time equivalents in the last year. Particularly what has driven some of this is the emergence of the Global Methodist Church. So you can find out more about us at wbs.edu. Also, I'd love for people to sign up for my email list at andymillerthird.com. That's andymillerIII.com. And if you sign up for my email list, I'll send you a free tool called 5 Steps to Deeper Teaching and Preaching. And you can find several other resources there as well. So we'd love for you to check those things out. All right. I am now glad to welcome into the podcast Dr. Philip Jenkins, who serves as a distinguished professor of history at Baylor University. He's written several very important books in history, fertility and faith. He's written A Storm of Images. He's written Next Christendom. And now the book that we're going to talk about today, Kingdoms of This World. I feel like I should sing Messiah, Dr. Jenkins, the kingdoms of this world. But thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, I want to start this conversation in a way that I don't normally do. And I'm going to tell a story, which as I was reviewing your book, it came to my mind multiple times because the themes of empire, I didn't say the subtitle, Kingdoms of This World, How Empires Have Made and Remade Religions. It's published by Baylor University Press. As we think about the way empires move, for many years, I was 6 generations in the Salvation Army, and I served as a Salvation Army officer or pastor for 15 years. And I happened to serve for 4 of those years in Gwinnett County, Georgia, which is at the time, was the most diverse county east of the Mississippi in the United States. And we were reaching new people there as well. But we also had many people who in their original context had been in Salvation Army churches wherever they were. And so we had more than 18 different countries of origin. And this is what I found. So the Salvation Army started, as you know, probably in England, and William Booth, the founder of Salvation Army, was very attracted to the British Empire and saw his work as kind of fulfilling some of the purposes of that empire itself. And so it moved all over the world. Now, here was a real practical thing that would come about, is that often I would find that I had a couple of British Salvationists in that congregation, but I also had Caribbean Salvationists. Mm-hmm. And when they would come together, often they could almost form, now this is, and some of them might be listening to this podcast, almost form a little political plank because they shared a lot. They shared a lot about the nature, not just of how societies and education function, but also how that particular denomination, the Salvation Army, should function. And then it wasn't a surprise later to see how not only would they agree about modes of worship, about ways a uniform should be worn, but they also agreed in how they ate. They would be the group that would have tea and biscuits at certain times. So I think I can see you smiling. So I think you see where I'm going, that there is a way that things that happen in the political sphere then impacts the religious sphere. So maybe you could unfold why that story, and I'm glad to do it too, how that connects to what this project is in this book.
It's a very trivial thing, but if you ask anyone from a country of the former British Empire, take them aside and ask them what the last letter of the alphabet is, because they all know that it's Z. It's not Z. That's only for Americans. And so, um, stepping back a long way from that, there's a famous quote from the 17th century where Thomas Hobbes says that the Catholic Church is the ghost of the old Roman Empire. That's a
Yeah.
famous phrase. But if you look around the world and you look at churches and you look at the other great religions, in virtually all cases, you can see them as ghosts of older empires. You can see the old maps, and you can also see the survival of the kind of ways and habits you describe. I mean, you could write a very good book, for instance, on the world's foods as the heirs of empire. You are what you eat, and you
Yes.
eat what empire your ancestors happen to belong to. So that's a very important thing. Where did tea come from? Tea was a product of the British Empire spread throughout the world. So, in other words, there are all these kind of inheritances, and you just have to unpack them a little bit. And when you start doing that, you see so much of the religions we know comes from those imperial roots.
Yes, I love that. So helpful. And that Thomas Hobbes quote you have at the very beginning kind of serves as a foundation for the rest of the book. You
Sure.
use this image of there being ghost of the empire throughout the book and impacting so many other areas. And of course, Thomas Hobbes in that moment is talking about the Roman Catholic Church as an expression of the Roman Empire. But I'm tempted to jump right into the Roman Empire, but you go back further than that.
Right.
And describing this. So I find it really helpful. And even before we go back further, let's say you do a great job of helping us understand your use of these terms, empire. And then I love the way that you expand on that to say empire-ness. So maybe
Yeah.
help us understand what you mean by empire and then empire-ness.
Okay. There are lots of different empires, and they all have their inheritances around the world. If you look at a map of the Roman Catholic Church, you can see the heritage of the Portuguese Empire and the Spanish Empire and the French Empire. Um, uh, but what I'm suggesting, it's not a case of a particular bunch of people. Empires tend to operate in the same ways, whether it's 3,000 years ago or in the modern world. What do they do? First of all, they bring together different people who would not have probably have known each other otherwise. They expand global horizons. They spread common languages. And if you look at the languages of faith through history, then you're looking at languages of empire, Latin, the Roman Empire, English, and the British Empire, and so on. Um, but you can also see other things, roads, sea routes. Empires have to get troops to different places. They have to bring in the goods from empire, and that means they have to be very good at communications. Empire is not the same as globalization, but it has a lot in common with it. Empires are modes of globalization. I mentioned how they spread things like foods. The empires change the landscape to suit themselves. They introduce crops. They do all sorts of things. But that's what I mean when I talk about commonalities. So it's not just the fact of the British Empire decided to do something. It's the
Mm.
fact that you have this idea of empire-ness. And I just mentioned one other thing.
Yeah, yeah, please do.
Empires are built usually by military force.
Hmm.
Empires have armies and navies, and armies and navies are among the best ways of bringing people together, taking people to parts of the world they never would have thought of going to otherwise. And when they go to those places, they take a couple of things. They take their memories of other parts of the world, and often they bring the religions they are used to. You spread religion not just by a king or an emperor saying, you shall follow my faith. Em Empires spread religions even if they don't intend to, and even if they very much don't want to, because of their natures of empire-ness.
Yes, that's really helpful. Now, in the context of the United States, there seems to be a sense that the word empire is a negative thing. Hence, we have, I'm sure, you can't, maybe even your publishers wanted to use a Star Wars image in the title of your book. But, the empire those are the bad guys, right? And
Mhm.
sometimes they actually have British accents too. Sorry to say that to all my British friends, but there you pick up on it right away. So like there's a resistance to the language of empire. How's that connected to one of the things that happens? I mean, because you described what you described there, these are good things that empires have brought.
Right. Now, we haven't got into any of like the moral, the ethical issues here. I'm just trying to do this as like
Right.
sober analysis. But these days, if you're in Europe, for example, all the anger or the complaints that we see in the US about racism and slavery are very focused on empire. Empire is seen as the source of all the injustice, inequality, conquest of people around the world, racial supremacy. So it's a very, very loaded concept. And I try and stay a little bit even-handed about this because
Yes.
empires often have done a lot of very good things in different times in different places. They've also done some absolutely terrible things. You mentioned the American example. Um, Boy, I'll just mention this very quickly. Americans for many years used to believe that they were the country that never had an empire.
Right.
In the last 25 years, if you go to a bookstore, you can't throw a stone without hitting a book on American empire.
Right.
American empire is one of the hottest subjects in the academic world right now.
Yes, yeah, I've noticed that too, and it often, and from the theological community too, it often comes from more mainline. And again, I'm not trying to make assessments; just I think it would be
Oh,
self-attest liberal branches that see this as equated with capitalist structures that marginalize other people and that sort of thing. So yeah, it is a very hot topic where people seem to bring that up in that context. So one of the things I'm interested in too is that like you go back and we talk, of course, we go to Rome, but you also go back to Persia
sure.
and tell us like how in the Persian context that then puts us in a position to understand how the Persian Empire impacts the development of religion.
Right. Well, there are these great Middle Eastern empires going back probably about 4,000 years or so. And again, they tend to be very cumulative. Each empire remembers its predecessor. Those are the kind of robes we should wear. This is what we should do. The Persian Empire is this great empire that runs roughly from about 600 BC to 600 AD. Very, very long lasting. In the early Christian centuries, there's a great, what you might call a superpower conflict going on between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, and the Persians come very close to winning. And if I tell the story of the Persian Empire, you're going to get a great sense of déjà vu because it's an empire that follows one particular faith, which is the Zoroastrian faith. They persecute Christians and try to wipe them out. But through their empireness, they spread habits and ways that unintentionally promote the growth of Christianity. They spread common languages. They build roads deep, deep into Central Asia. So while they're trying to stamp out Christians and wipe them out, those same Christians are using those roads to undertake missionary ventures deep into Central Asia, pushing into China.
Mm,
Um, so when the Persian Empire eventually ends, there are Christians everywhere. And one of the stories I do sort of like the last Persian emperor uh, is killed in a very ignominious, shameful way, and it is a Christian bishop who buries him. and that last emperor's heirs flee to China, where they probably become Christians. So there is a
Mm,
great sense of that Christian story. It just reminds us we're used to the Christian story in Europe. Don't forget, there's another, and in some ways even larger story in Asia,
mm.
that great Persian Empire.
Yeah, it comes through that. It's so fascinating. And you show too, there's Persian and Roman emphases. I loved your chapter that talked about even the impact in the Bible on using imperial themes. Now, some people might think, okay, yeah, we know the word that where we get evangelistic or evangelism comes from a term that's referring to the Roman Empire, but you show like you can hardly get a few sentences in Scripture in the New Testament to see the impact of empire.
Well, right. Or did, the Old Testament count the number of references to
Oh,
the
sure.
Egyptian Empire, to
Yes.
Pharaoh or the Nile? How many references are there to Babylon?
Yes.
How many hundred references? Babylon was the great empire. The Jewish people lived on the fringes of that. They had a very mixed relationship with it. But in the New Testament, look at the places, and so many of them are named for Greek emperors, Greek kings, Roman emperors. When you read about Philippi or Laodicea, when you read about the Lake of Tiberias, um, every street they walk on is a Roman street built on Greek foundations. I use the word there. When art historians look at painting, they sometimes find one that is an old painting and somebody's painted over it and maybe painted over it again, and they call that a palimpsest. And what I say is the world of Jesus and Paul is a palimpsest of empires,
Mm.
Greek and Roman, and at every point. I'm sorry, did I mention Paul, the man who was a Jew who took a Roman imperial name from a Roman family?
Yes, yes. There it is. Yeah, and so, some people seem to think because Peter's name is changed, right? Name changed to Peter. They assume that Paul's name is happens at his conversion, but it seems to be probably a missionary tactic. Saul to Paul. This is a Romanized version of his name so that he can connect in that given context.
It might be, but there's another possibility, which is it might be that his family were freed people. They had been slaves, and when you got freed, you took the name of that family.
Interesting.
But there's a very strong kind of Roman dimension there. But at every point when you look at place names, personal names, you look at how many things happen at places like Caesarea, named for Caesar,
Yes.
Philippi, all those Greek names. And the other thing you can do, look at a map of the Roman roads of the empire, which are the equivalent of our modern interstates, and look at how so much of what happens in the career of Paul happens on the cities along that road. There's a great one called the Via Egnatia. It is a Roman world at every point.
Yes, it's this structure, this empireness, like as you say, that then positions Christianity to spread throughout the world. That's the foundation. I mean,
Right, and of course, how they do it is through the languages of the day, which are the great languages of empire. And, we think obviously, well, there's Greek, okay, and that comes from the great empires of Alexander and the people who followed him. There's Latin, and you also have the two great other imperial languages of the day, Syriac from the Eastern empires, and Coptic, which is the old language of the Egypt of the pharaohs. Languages originally were probably spoken in like smaller areas, but empires spread them over long, long, long distances. I wonder what languages Paul could have spoken. Could he have spoken Syriac? Well, he could have talked to people in Syriac, certainly.
yeah.
We know him in Greek. to use a phrase, what language does he speak? He speaks empire.
Interesting. Wow. Yeah, yeah. And people might hesitate hearing you say that, but just remember, like, go back to that definition that you had of empireness. This is kind of like the way that this was the water that Paul was swimming in. This was just all around him. Um, Now, I want to come back to eventually to the Christian examples that you use. And I think it's interesting too. Like you spend the first part of this book just describing the spread, and then eventually you get to the place where you talk about the unintended consequences throughout it. So, but there's other, it's not just a Christian phenomenon where religions follow empire. You highlight a variety of examples of this happening. So I'm interested to see like how Buddhism followed empires as well. You want to trace some of that for us? Yeah, the book is very thorough. So whatever 5-10 minute answer you have here, there's much more data that you can explore in the book. But I'd love for you to just give a thumbnail sketch of it.
Gotcha. In fact, when you write the story of Buddhism, it's almost you only have to change a couple of words, and it's almost like describing the history of Christianity.
Mm.
Buddhism grows up within empires. Those empires come to support it. It is a great missionary religion that spreads around the world, but over time, it is basically almost wiped out in its homeland. I'm sorry, which am I talking about? Well, both of them. The
Yeah.
story of Buddhism, and it spreads into Central Asia and China and East Asia and so on. At every point, the key variable is when some local king looks at the great empire of the day and thinks, I'll take their religion, then they'll respect me, and I can be like that. That's exactly what barbarian kings do in Europe, and it's exactly what kings do and emperors do in Asia. It's what they do in Japan and Korea and Thailand and so on. They have this great imperial ambience. They want to be like the really big boys. And the way you do it is you absorb their religion, you patronize the monks. Oh, and by the way, as in Europe, the monks are really good about writing you up. You
Mm.
want a miracle story about your birth? They will do it. They're very happy to do it. They want to say what a wonderful person you are. They will do it. So there's like a collaboration going on. Um, but Buddhism spreads through. Monasteries go into an area, they develop the faith there, and they become the center of the religion. It's about the first 1500 years of Christianity.
Wow. In some of these places, like you could almost pick a country, like a country. You highlight some of this that's like right next to another, but there's an entirely different culture that's developed, and then simultaneously there's a different religion, and you kind of show the source of that is the empireness that was at the foundation of that society. Maybe example. Could you give an example of one of those? Like, well, let me just. How about the Philippines? That was really interesting.
Okay. Well, I talk a lot about.
Whatever you want. Sorry, I just threw one out there,
No,
but
no,
go
no.
ahead. Yeah.
This is fine. This is fine. Yeah, in the West, we're generally not familiar with these great Indian empires, for example. But if you follow them over time, they tend to support Buddhism and spread it. But then something very interesting happens. There is a, a struggle going on between religions, which Christians in the West never have to deal with because they don't have a rival religion. You don't have Christians fighting against Druids trying to come back. In India, you do. You have
Mm,
Hindus and Buddhists. And when Hindus take over, they tend to um, remove support for Buddhism. Buddhism fades. And so you've got the situation like in what we would call Indonesia, where you have these incredible Buddhist monuments and temples, some of the greatest in the world, but they're in places where there are no Buddhists
mm,
anymore. So you're not just explaining how religions spread, which is something that we all think about, but how they cease to exist, which is a
mm.
really interesting phenomenon if you think about it. We
So
think of
it ceased to exist altogether in a given region, or just as. as a whole? Are we thinking of some other religious examples?
Well, the great example, if you make a list of the four or five great world religions as they were 1,000 years ago, you can name the obvious ones: Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, Hinduism, Manichaeanism.
Mm-hmm.
Manichaeism was a religion that emerged in the third century AD, and it spread ultimately from France to China. And it operated alongside Christians and Buddhists, but because they did not have the right patronage of an empire, they got snuffed out. And if by any chance a Manichaean phones into this program and says they're still around, tell me immediately because I haven't.
Yeah, that's interesting. Now in one of the chapters where you spend time talking about Islam, you suggest that Islam and the empires with Islam conditioned the geographical and cultural spread of the faith.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that was really interesting.
Yeah, sure. If you look at where Muslims are today. Of course, they're around the world. But the main Muslim countries, if you map them, what you end up with is a map of where the caliphates, that is, the early Arab empires, got to by round about the year 800. Now, they've
Mm-hmm.
moved beyond that, obviously, but the core countries, roughly from Morocco to Pakistan, are a map of that great caliphate. Um,
Yes.
things have changed, things have improved. And I'm not trying to say there that Islam is solely a matter of conquest. It absolutely isn't any more than Christianity. But here's something I always find a little bit controversial to think about. We tend not to think of our religions, whatever they are, spreading only by conquest. There's all sorts of other ways. There's mission. But when persecution happens, if a religion does not have a state to back it up, it can be destroyed altogether.
Mm.
And that's how dependent are religions on states? And that's an interesting idea. It's one maybe it's a little difficult to think of. Christianity used to be spread throughout Central Asia, but it didn't have a state to rely on, so they got swept up and
Yeah.
destroyed. And these are now
Yeah, I mean,
very
some would suggest then, like what you have in China is this emergence in other Asian countries where there isn't a state to support it. They might use the idea of Tertullian that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the faith, and that the Christian witness is growing in those contexts, maybe because of persecution. I don't know. That might be one response.
It is, but you chose an interesting example. You chose Tertullian. Tertullian was from a country that we today call Tunisia, where until the French got there in the 19th century, there were basically no Christians.
Mm,
So in Tertullian's
yes.
country, there might have been lots of martyrs, but it didn't
Yeah.
keep
Yeah.
the church alive.
No, thank you. That's good. Now, this is the little bit of conflict, and you don't necessarily address this, and I think that's a good move as a historian through this book. Like you're describing what has happened in showing these connections, but it does bring up the conflict for me theologically. Is are we just dealing with the sociology? Is religion just the sociology of empires?
Huh.
And I know that that's I'm putting on a different hat, like it's an assessment, evaluative hat. But I find myself thinking of that, and I guess as a Christian who's serving in a seminary, the way that I analyze that and the way that I kind of process that as reading your book is that this is a part of the way God has God's created a world where there's an opportunity for people to freely respond, and he uses the mechanisms of empireness that you describe. I'm glad. I'd be glad to hear your perspective on that.
Well, it's a very good question. It's a very challenging question, um, because it gets to the question of whether something just happens or whether it is intended by providence.
Right,
So, if,
right.
say, for example, Constantine won a battle in the year 312, and he granted toleration to the church, and that was a pure matter of chance. And had things worked out differently, the church history would have been different. Well, okay. But there's a huge biblical tradition that says that things like victories in war and worldly success are not just a matter of, excuse the expression, one damn thing after another.
Yeah.
They are intention. They're a matter of divine intention of and of providence. Um, so I have no problem with that at all. But it then does get to another interesting question. Suppose you look at an area where Christianity was once very strong, and
Yeah.
when it ceases to exist, does that mean
Yeah.
that God's providence allowed that to happen?
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
That's a challenging question. Somebody might say, well, maybe those people were uniquely sinful. Well, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't go that. I mean, some would suggest that, and I probably wouldn't fall in that camp. But I think it's I lean back in the reality that God, in His providence, has created the world in such a way where His love, which is a essential part of His characteristic, is something that isn't forced, but instead something that is chosen. He makes the first move. It's his effort in the world, but then we have the opportunity to respond. Now, of course, this then mingles in with the challenges of like the philosophical and theological challenges, the fate of the unevangelized. And I talk about that in some of my other studies along the way. But so people can go to some of the resources I have on a short thing on heaven and hell. I won't get into those details, but I do think that there is something to the fact that even a society has an opportunity to access God's good intentions for their governmental structures. And if that's the case, like there are aspects of, say, capitalism that produce flourishing for people, and so accessing that then is a part of, maybe that's something that God has put into like our very being that we can use to access the good life, so to speak. I'm kind of like wandering around here, but it just kind of like this is the tension that arises as we think about the way that empires facilitate some of this. And I think some of it is good. Some of it is, and that's not. I know the historian's question is not to say what is good or bad. I get that, but I can't help but go there to think about ethics as we respond to some of this.
To use another example, I mean, if you look at the history of North America, you have multiple competing empires representing different religious traditions. You have, the Protestant colonies of the British North America, you have the Catholic French, you have the Catholic Spanish. There are several conflicts and battles where things could easily have gone the other way. Well, who knows? The French could have won, not the
Yes.
British. Um, so, do you then say that the religious history of North America is a matter of chance, a throw of the dice? Or do you say, as some people would, no, there's a providence guiding this? And that's a key question. And if you look in my index, you will not find the word providence because I'm not dealing with this from a theological point of view. But I am saying the fact that one talks a lot about political events and imperial events does not mean that you are shutting out religious interpretations. You are just not consciously addressing them.
That's right. That's helpful. And you feel in your calling, I don't know if you identify as a calling as a historian. I think that's one of the tasks that you have to do to
Right, I
separate
think
this out.
so.
Yeah.
It can be a balance. But as I say, the argument of uh, something went wrong on a battlefield on one particular day, and therefore this religion took over this country. Well, there's a strong biblical tradition which says that things don't just happen to go wrong.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
So
Yeah,
providence,
this is determinism, compatibilism,
yeah.
libertarian free will. Like all these things come together as we think about the events of history. And so, like, I would probably land to say that some of these things happen as a result of the libertarian free will that we have, but God in His providence, as we've said multiple times, uh, chooses to use those events. Like he masters them for his ultimate purposes. And that's where I guess as a theologian, I kind of lean back and say, I'm thankful for all that happens in space and time now. But I also recognize, like, I affirm that God created the world out of nothing, that Jesus was raised from the dead, and that there will be a time where there'll be a new heavens and a new earth. And as a result of that, like, the things that don't make sense now will make more sense in light of eternity. I don't want that to
I,
be a punt. Help me
no,
if
no.
you want to.
I,
Yeah.
I also raise the question of time frame. And so if you say that a particular cause has failed in a particular area, in what time frame? There's a Catholic scholar called Richard McBrien, and he used to say we should be guided by what happens in the early Christian era, that is the first 20,000 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen.
Um, and so if, for instance, a church has disappeared in country A, and we'd say, oh, why has this terrible thing happened? Well, come back in 2,000 years and maybe it'll be stronger.
Yeah. Amen. Amen. No, I take, or even from the seat of eternity. Um, uh, So yeah, no, that's really this. I thank you for going here in this conversation. I noticed, like, I have to say, like, when I even got your book and I got the physical copy, I noticed, like, that I would say a who's who of historical theologians endorsing this book, who grapple with these questions, including yourself, of course, Mark Knoll, Tim Larson, Thomas Kidd, David Bebbington, and like. And so, like, I know that as you read the literature yourself, and I know just even going through your book, you're aware, like, these, even though you're talking about the way empires have facilitated the development of religion, when you look at what these religions are talking about, they're talking about these type of questions. So I think it's important to discuss them.
Sure, they often are. I was very pleased to get that list of recommenders. It's a stellar list. I was very pleased.
Yeah, and maybe that be something to connect. The Mark Knoll and Tim Larson have put together a series of books about the British dissenting tradition,
Hmm.
and it's a series of books published by Oxford, that kind of outlines what they call, kind of, the out of England missionary effort that comes from that dissenting movement. And I think that's an important part. Like, the worlds that you and I live in are shaped by this out of England perspective. So maybe you could just highlight some of the things that you describe. And I've jumped around them a little bit. Even my story at the beginning is connected to that. But what are some of those influences of the British Empire on the way that it created paths for the dissenting tradition to create this missionary movement?
Boy, that's where on earth do you start?
I know. I'm sorry.
No, no,
They
no,
wrote
it's
six
fine. It's
volumes
fine.
on it, so I'm sorry. But you
Fine.
addressed some of it here, so I'm sorry.
Sure. I always draw one big distinction. We talk about mission, we talk about the spread of Christianity or any religion. I always say, I'm not interested in mission, I'm interested in the spread of religion. What's the difference? Very often, people go to an area not with the conscious intention of taking religion, but they take their religion with them and it spreads. Australia is a great example. The fact that Australia, for many years, was, this great Protestant Catholic country, that wasn't the result of missionaries, that was the result of migration.
Mm-hmm,
Migrants
mm-hmm.
are very significant in that way. And it's very hard to draw a line between the two. What empires do in particular areas like, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, wherever, and originally in North America, um, they spread people who are there for their own good and those of their families, not to create some kind of religious utopia. We always think of America in terms of the pilgrims and religious refugees. Well, yeah, there are some of those, but most of those people are settlers, migrants. They're there to do good for themselves, and they
Mm.
spread religion in the same way. Um, what the British did was, of course, they spread the Church of England, but they're also wide open to spreading. For instance, Methodism is the obvious one. You can map Presbyterians and so on around the world. And the other thing is, you used a forbidden word earlier. You talked about the
Uh-oh.
you talked about the English. Well, don't forget, it's the English and the Scottish and the
Yes,
Irish
I'm
and the
sorry.
Welsh. No, 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 not a problem. But
My ancestors would be so disappointed with me.
I'm sure. So, for example, I'm presently speaking from an area of Pennsylvania where the first white settlement was very heavily from Northern Irish Presbyterians. And you can see their names all over the place. They were what we would today call climate refugees. They were escaping a climate disaster in Ireland, and
Hmm.
they tried to create to reproduce the land they knew in Pennsylvania. They then spread through Kentucky and Tennessee and down to Texas. But so much of if you map some of these denominations, there's a whole ethnic history, there's an imperial history. Often you're dealing with people who are rebels against empire, who
Yes.
are escaping from empire.
Yes. Yeah, this is fascinating. I love that you talk about mapping and even just think about your
Yeah.
location and and you could pick up on that history, like you say, rebels of empire. If you were to even go around and look at the street signs where you are in any given community, if you see the names of streets, you're probably going to find what it was in the founding of the area. And the same thing would be true with names of churches. How many Asbury
Sure.
churches are there throughout the United States? I mean, just hundreds,
Sure.
Asbury Methodist churches. So, like, yeah, that's fascinating that we can see that in the very structures that have been a part of the founding of those societies.
Right. And an area of great interest to me, of course, I work a lot on Africa, and you see the overlapping denominations there, which spread under the auspices of empire, though not the empire deciding, oh, let's have this many Presbyterians or this many Methodists. Their empire-ness creates the opportunities for that spread. And often the denominations will last long after the empire has gone. A great example in East Africa, an area that was ruled by Germans before the First World War. They created a very strong Lutheran settlement. The German Empire failed in 1914 in that area, but there's still a lot of Lutherans.
Mm,
Follow the
yes. Yeah, that's so now here's an interesting phenomenon too. That in it, thinking of Africa, it's like not only do the denominations last beyond the empire, but sometimes thinking of it out of, I'm just using the example of the out of England type of perspective. Sometimes then the denominations come back to the original empire's home and actually bring the religion.
right.
Let me give an example. Maybe this is not following what you're saying, but so for instance, in the again, I mentioned my connection to the Salvation Army. It's interesting to me that so many people have come back from African context to the United Kingdom, and often when they get there, they've embraced, and there's been generations of embracing a historical form of that denomination that's very rigid in adherence to wearing uniforms, even brass bands. Well, then they come back the to the United Kingdom where it came from, and they don't find, and this is just anecdotal, they don't find the same Salvation Army, and so they've actually gone and like created informal networks that affirm something that's probably more akin to what came to their country 100 years ago.
You see that example of like Africans, for example, in Britain is so classic, because Britain has become so secularized in recent years. So much of the Christian activity is African, it's Caribbean, it's South Indian. There are strong South Indian Christian communities. Um, the four largest mega churches in Britain, and yes, indeed, there are mega churches in Britain, are all pastored by Africans. Um,
Wow.
if you look at there are Nigerian pastors everywhere. If you look in the Catholic seminaries in the United States and in Europe, you will see Nigerians everywhere.
Yeah.
Uh,
So it's interesting, like that goes back and forth then.
it is, and there is an interplay. It's never I think maybe back 50, 60 years ago, people used to think of mission in these very crude terms of, a very stereotyped imperialist would arrive in an area and try and bully people into accepting a religion. And usually they would accept the religion in a form that worked for them, possibly
Hmm.
within the denomination, possibly not. But once it was theirs, it could not be taken back, and they would
Mm.
then run with it in a way that worked for them. And in some cases, the denominations virtually failed in the home country and would then have to be, I don't know, do you want to speak of reconversion, re-evangelization?
Yes, yeah.
And again, I draw my distinction. It's not necessarily a question of African mission to England. It's a
Hmm.
question of Africans coming to England, living there, setting up churches, and those then spread. It's not so much conscious mission. It's here we are, this is what we do. Oh, and by the
Mm.
way, there's this great spread of new churches. If I looked at the French Empire or the Belgian Empire, I find all these Francophone churches. I find Congolese and Madagascar pastors in Paris and Brussels. Exactly the same story.
Mm, mm, hmm.
I mean,
It,
it's almost impossible to do. I swore I would write this book without using the phrase "The Empire Strikes Back." I failed.
yeah, that's exactly it. Did you? Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to avoid. It's just a part of our regular culture. Like you can't help but make it. But yeah, ends up being what happens. Now, in my immediate context, I serve in the context of a broad Methodist movement. Though I'm at a non-denominational seminary. There was a movement to decades ago in the United Methodist Church to include the African expressions of United Methodism. Well, what ended up happening is that the American United Methodist Church, generally in itself, has started to move away from traditional Christian teachings on human sexuality. Well, then what happened though? They had by that point already included. I'm sure you know this, but I'm just expressing how this works out. Then by the time you start to have votes, that because the Africans have been a part of this, not just Africans, but in a few other countries as well, then they couldn't ever win the vote. And so it's really interesting that that becomes a part of what's happening. And now people say, I mean, it's common. I'm just using the language of missions again, that it's common to say we need to have the um, African church or Filipino church or whatever come and evangelize us. So like what you're saying, I really do see that happening. And maybe there's some good to that too. Again, I can maybe put that to God's providence that even when people go astray, they can find a source for the truth. Maybe that comes from outside of themselves. Well, I think you just pressed mute. I'm gonna somehow I saw you start to move your hands. So
You are correct, and I do
okay, there you
apologize.
go.
Um, but if you think of where people move or where they carry out mission, historically, that is often constrained by imperial traditions and imperial traditions and imperial languages. So, for example, we're all used
Yeah.
to the words Anglophone and Francophone, English speaking, French speaking. Somebody could write a wonderful book on Lusophone Christianity, the Christianity that exists within the Portuguese speaking world, which obviously is Portugal and it's Brazil and it's Angola and Mozambique, very populous countries with a very rich range of churches, and people will travel very freely between them. Not that there's like
Yes.
a natural land bridge between Angola and Brazil, but because that's where the imperial heritage was, that's where we speak the language, that's where I can set up and talk to people.
Yes, no, that yeah, I love how you're connecting these dots for me. If I'm curious, Dr. Jenkins, in your esteemed career, like you've put together a lot of different ideas to help people see. I think in the seminary world, your next Christendom really help people for, okay, I'll say for me and many people in my tradition, help people see the importance of the global South. Now, I'm sure anthropologists and others have been there many years ahead of where I was, but that book was key for me understanding what's happening globally. I'm curious how this book, Kingdoms of this World, how this fits into your scholarly career. As you kind of trace the things that you've written through the years, what part does this play in the puzzle of your academic writing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've written on a lot of different topics. I've written several on kind of the Roman, the Byzantine empires, but also because of my British and British history background, I'm familiar with just the sheer amount of energy that's gone into um, studying empire. And as I study global religion, global Christianity, there are a number of themes that emerge very strongly for me. One is demography, and I published a book on that a couple of years ago. But empires just show up everywhere. I
Mm,
use that example of the Portuguese-speaking world. It's not the Portuguese-speaking world, it's the ghost of the Portuguese Empire.
wow. Yeah. Yeah.
And once you get into it, you just see those themes and recognize those themes everywhere. And I like to think I have a very broad kind of global vision here that I can apply. So that's really where that came from. You just can't stop stumbling across empire as a unifying theme.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
It's true.
it's not that I found empire, empire found me.
Wow, interesting. Yes. When I first time I traveled to the Caribbean, actually it's just on a cruise. I and I've only been on one cruise, to say that, and it was a long time ago. But
Hmm.
when I got off the boat, I think I was in the Bahamas, and when I arrived, I saw that the police officers that were there close by, just kind of at the port where we were coming in, they looked really familiar to me. And I was trying to figure out, actually, I thought they were part of my denomination
Oh,
because their uniforms at the time I was in the Salvation Army, they had if you see a typical Salvation Army shield, it has a ecclesial language. It says blood and fire on it, but it has a crown that looks very similar to the British crown, and that's exactly. I mean, that was where it came from. So, but I saw these uniforms, and they looked exactly like a Salvation Army uniform, except it just didn't have the S's. So I see,
mm,
I felt it in that moment, and it was a real question for you. I see you leaning forward. I'm glad for you to respond to that. Like this is an
sure.
expression of that idea.
Very good example because what the Salvation Army did was it took the way that the army dressed at that time. There are my two M words here are the military and memory. The
Mm,
military is a very good way of preserving memory through the generations. And I tell one story. If you live in the United States, you've certainly seen state police officers in states like PA and many others who have what we might call Smokey Bear hats.
yes,
And
this
you
is
think,
interesting. Yeah.
all right, so where did they come from? Okay, here's the story. Back in 1900, the US was fighting a war in the Philippines, which was just annexed as part of its empire. They created a special force to suppress rebels. It was very much like the Vietnam War, and they called them the Philippine Constabulary, and they wore these helmets because that was the standard military garb of the time. 1905, Pennsylvania wanted to create a new police force to suppress labor unrest. They hired a lot of these Philippine guys with their helmets. And so the imperial helmet of the day survives as the Smoky Bear police
Ha!
helmet today. It is an
Wow.
imperial thing.
Wow. Yes. That's amazing. Yeah.
Oh, and and you also see it in language. So if you're in the military and you talk about something happening out in the wild, out in the boonies, which is a word they picked up in the Philippine War in 1900. It's a Tagalog word.
Interesting. I had no idea. I didn't know that at all. Empire finds you.
Empire finds you, or rather, maybe it's all around you. It's certainly true in England or France or whatever, but in the United States, more than you think.
Yeah. When I was in kindergarten, I was my it was a half day kindergarten, and my dad came to pick me up. But I didn't know that actually he was coming to pick me up. But we were all at the door, and this I lived in Michigan at the time, so we all had to get all of our in his winter time, all of our snow clothes on to be ready to go home. Well, all of a sudden, I saw all of the children go to the door and push against the door with their hands. They're all holding back and they're like, don't let him in. Don't let him in. And I'm like, well, why not? And so I started pushing as well. I didn't even see what was happening. We were all like, and then the words from one of my classmates came, a police officer's here to take away our teacher. Well, it happened to be my father who was wearing a Salvation Army uniform with a Salvation Army cap, right?
Fascinating.
So, I mean, there it is. Empire finds me.
Right.
Well, Dr. Jenkins, thank you so much for taking time with me today. I have one more question for you. It's unrelated to your book, but it might be a part of it. The name of my podcast is More to the Story. And I like to think of that as like going deeper to study with people, to hear from people what has been a part of their work, their writing. But also I have a theological sense. In our tradition, we think of the transformation of the individual being identified as sanctification. So there's more than just getting our sins forgiven. But I always like to ask a question, is there more to the story of you, Dr. Jenkins? Maybe something you don't share very much, like a hobby or something fun that you like to do that you maybe don't talk about very often?
Oh boy, that's a very tough question. I've always believed that life is a crutch for people without the nerve to face the cinema. Uh, I'm a great watcher of films.
Do you
You
have
know,
a
oh
favorite
boy,
movie?
I have a range of very favorite directors like the
Oh, okay.
Coens and the David Lynch, who just passed away very recently, and some others like that. There are many I swear to there. Um, and before you ask, yes, there are some great religious films. One of the best of which fits perfectly in the present topic. It is a Japanese film called The Burmese Harp, which is the greatest Buddhist film ever made, and which the Vatican has listed as one of the two or three greatest religious films ever made. It's about a Japanese POW in Burma who becomes a Buddhist monk in order to fulfill the rest of his life burying the dead. And it's just
Huh.
this dazzling, dazzling film. But you'll notice I tend to answer in terms of film. I'm not sure what else I would have that would fit too well into your question, but I would just throw out a couple of things there.
That's fun. Well, of course, like you said, you couldn't even help but bring Star Wars in even to this interview. I wondered when it would come. I wondered when we just have to say The Empire Strikes Back. Maybe that's what I'll call this podcast. Who knows?
You might, but you're referring to a lot of things that happened, in the before the Dark Times and before the Empire.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a quote
Well,
also.
absolutely. Well, Dr. Jenkins, thank you for your time today. It means a lot to me and to our audience that you came along. And I encourage people to find this book. And like I said at the very beginning, it helped me even understand what happened to me many years ago in Gwinnett County, Georgia. But it's published by Baker Press, Kingdoms of This World, How
Taylor Press.
Empires Have what that I said, oh, sorry, Baylor. I saw the big B.
Correct.
Forgive me. Baylor University Press. My friend
Thank
Todd
you.
Still would make sure I had that right from the seminary there at Truett. How empires have made and remade religions. Thank you so much, Dr. Jenkins. God bless you.
Thank you for your hospitality.